Okay, so hello everyone. I am Gwendal Fouché, and I'd like to thank you for being here for my PhD defense entitled Immersive in Interactive Visualization of 3D Temporal Data. So this thesis was financed in the context of the INRIA Challenge Naviscope, which aims at improving paradigms of high-dimensional biological imagery datasets. So first, to put things back in context, 3D temporal datasets are getting more and more common in scientific domains because of the progress in simulation and acquisition of large temporal 3D datasets, as well as the surrounding technologies for analysis and storage of this data. So it's notably present in domains such as biological imaging, medical imaging as well. But also geography, such as in this example of 3D trajectory, 3D plane trajectory data sets, or in this second example, in CAD construction schedule software, where we can see that the temporal axis is represented on the vertical axis in the application. So these two examples are very different examples of 3D temporal datasets, but this raise several main challenges involving this kind of data. The first one is about the diversity of the type of data that we need to handle, and the diversity of use cases as well. The second main challenge is about the representation of time. So one of the example represents time, the temporal information on one axis. The other is the information is directly in the trajectories. And there is also an additional challenge because of the additional numerical and categorical information that can be present in this kind of data sets, making for quite high dimensional and complex data. So biological imagery is one of the most dominant domain in terms of production of this kind of data. And they make for also really diverse analytical use cases. So in this first, we present here three examples. The first one is a embryo development imaging. So here the view is very dense. So there is a high density of objects, and there is a strong evolution of the shape of these individual objects as well, and the full structure also. This second example is a CD63 and CD63 endosomes and mitochondria imaging. So the inside of a cell. Here the endosomes are actually segmented and tracked. And here we have a really different example with really sparse visualization, really sparse objects. And there is very small movements as well. In the third example, it's simulation of calcium signals in an imaging of an astrocyte. And here the issue is that the objects are quite sparse as well, quite medium-sized, but they are very short in terms of duration, which can be quite difficult to visualize this way. So again, really different examples, really different use cases, which raise the main question, how to explore, in general, 3D temporal data sets. So the first part of our approach will focus on the temporal length of these of the dynamics that we can see in this data. And to do so, we will introduce the notion of 4D objects, which is basically an extension of the natural notion of 3D objects, which involves temporal characteristics, basically the lifespan, the duration, the time before start and end of the objects in the data sets, which we call lifespan. So for example, in the previous example, the cells, the endosomes, or the calcium signals could all be 4D objects. And as such, the first axis of our approach will be around the analysis of the duration of the lifespan of 4D objects. Then to approach these 4D objects, we get interested in the field of, in methods from the field of immersive analytics. So basically it's a field that involves immersion techniques to support visualization. The first main benefits is about the use of VR environments, which provide with increased depth perception and with a very large workspace. So for example, in here, In this video, the users can visualize complex volumetric shapes, the volumetric structure, and have used the large workspace to display several instances with different parameters in order to have a larger overview of the data sets. The second main benefit is about 3D interaction, which helps with natural navigation in the environment and also supports analytical tasks. So for example, here, the user can select through a bimanual selection method, can select some trajectories in large 3D trajectory data sets. So as such, the second axis of our approach will be around contributing to the field of immersive analytics in order to balance between methods methods of visualization to be able to display the various types of 4D objects, and methods and balancing with methods of 3D interaction to support to achieve analytical tasks. So to summarize, our first axis will be around the duration of the lifespan of 4D objects, and the second axis will be the focus of the immersive analytics contribution, whether oriented toward visualization or 3D interaction. We propose on this two-axis graph, 3 contributions. The first one will be the space-time hypercube, 3D timelines, and space and time selection that we will present along this presentation. But first, we explored the literature mostly around the question of temporal visualization in the general case. The main challenges of temporal visualization, so basically which aim at helping with the analysis of temporal information in general, the main challenges rely first on how to represent time, how to encode basically the temporal information, then how to explore time, how to navigate, maybe just to be able to see the whole temporal information. Maybe it needs some interaction to explore. And finally, how to see the temporal relations. So basically the link between time and the other dimension, the other information present in various kind of data sets. So there are 2 main classes of temporal visualization. The first one is dynamic temporal visualization. So this kind of visualization relies on mapping the temporal information actually on real time. So it can work with animation, so basically video playback control. So for example, here, this software is a 3D molecular simulation visualization software. And we have on the side a few options to play, stop, and fast forward the speed of the simulation. Other dynamic methods can rely on interaction using, basically the goal is to have direct control over the current time with, for example, sliders as the two graphs beneath the 3D view. Here, the user can just move the slider to explore time. One last method for dynamic methods relies on what we call time warping. So basically, the time warping, it's kind of like animation, so it's a kind of video playback control, but the user can control the curve, deciding at which speed the time will elapse. So the point is to be able to control the curve to accelerate during moments where there are less interesting features, and to be able to slow down for more interesting features. So the second main class of the temporal visualization is for static visualization. So here the point of this method is to try to map time on space, on the spatial dimension. So the main morale here is eyes bit memory. The idea is to be able to, to support the analysis, to have access directly to the temporal information. So for example, it can rely on the extraction of regions of interest. So in this example, there is the 6 first images show a complex 3D temporal, volumetric 3D temporal information, and some pieces of this 4D information can be extracted and put together in this graph with links in order to explore 4D information into a 2D graph only. So it's another layer of abstraction that can be quite difficult, but in the end, we end up with a 2D visualization. Another type of another static method relies on dimension reduction, so basically projection of the information. Yeah, here, for example, each of the small arrows, the small vectors are individual objects, and their movements are projected into the visualization that we can see on the bottom. And finally, static methods also rely on juxtaposition, as in actually these two examples, in order to have several visualizations showing maybe different parts of the data, maybe the different dimension, and to have them just side by side to support the analysis. So to summarize, so between the dynamic and static temporal visualization map time differently. One maps time directly on real time, the other maps the information on space. There is a different level of abstraction. Dynamic methods might be more maybe easier to understand, since it maps time on time. Actually, it's maybe less abstract. But static visualization gives maybe the whole temporal information in order to have direct access to the information directly to perform a direct analysis. So since our approach relies on immersive technology, we have increased spatial understanding. We have a larger workspace. So as such, we got more interested into static temporal visualization. And to be more specific, we're going to be interested in two main types of visualization. The first one is the space-time cube that inspired our first contribution. So this type of visualization consists in taking 2D temporal data and displaying them in a 3D view. But the issue with that is that there is the literature reports quite a steep learning curve because of the abstraction of mapping time into space. And the other main issue is that with direct rendering of this kind of volume, there is often problems of occlusion and clutter. So for example, here, this is the Chronos projector tries to map a video into a volume. So this is a video of a city going from day to night. So yeah, quite a few problems of occlusion here. The second type of visualization, which inspired actually our second contribution, is the timelines. So basically timelines try to map the temporal information on a single axis in space. Most often it's a linear axis, as in these two examples, with different branches, different way to display the information depending on the use case. But timelines can also be circular or in spiral, like here, with this example of sunlight illumination over days over cycle of the spiral. So timelines are very diverse types of diverse and flexible types of visualization, which can help creating perceptually and narratively beneficial kind of visualizations. So now that we explored a bit the literature around the temporal visualization, I will now present our first contribution, the space-time hypercube. So our goal here is to use not space-time cubes, since it's only for 2D temporal data, but space-time hypercubes in order to be able to represent the 3D temporal information. So first, going back a bit on the literature, the space-time cube have been used not as visualization, but mostly as representation of the data, as an abstraction of the 2D temporal data. Bach proposed a taxonomy of operations, basically volumetric operations that we could do on space-time cubes in order to be able to create a visualization from volumetric operations. For example, with complex operation, the goal is to be able to extract meaningful visualization. So here on the right side image, you have a space-time cube with geographical information, geographical and temporal information, and through an operation of flattening, so a projection in time, we can obtain the image on your left that is actually the same information but flattened. So we kind of lose the temporal information, and we have these two views, but the left one might be easier to approach. So from this type of representation, well, we propose to generalize the notion of space-time cube in 4D in order to maybe to get inspired with this kind of operations. So the idea is to represent the 3D temporal information into a 4D volume. So of course there will be visualization issues. First, a 4D volume cannot be represented directly, cannot be displayed directly. So we need to project this 4D volume at least into 3D. So there will be a loss of information, a loss of data, and on the other hand, the model can be quite complex. As you can see here, it's with the embryo example. The model can be quite large and complex. So we aim for methods relying on a user-driven projection of our space-time hypercube into a space-time cube visualization. So the methods to extract a view from the space-time hypercube relies first on a user-placed clipping plane. So here the user just cuts into the embryo model, and then we do a rendering of the cross-section of the embryo with any information that we could require, and finally we stack these captures into a volume, as seen in the first third image. And so this is the type of a visualization that we get. So yeah, this is basically this is a perspective and cutaway views of the space-time cube obtained, and this is basically the evolution of this cut over time. So we obviously need methods to explore this complex 3D structure, and propose to use methods of to be able to create cutaway views, to be able to explore inside the space-time cube, and to be able also to select and highlight individual 4D objects in this view. We also require methods of filtering to be able to remove a bit of the, clarify this clutter of the visualization. So we could filter by time, by value, depending on the information available, and by objects. We also propose to juxtapose these two views, so the original 3D representation of the embryo with the generated space-time cube, and also to support this the exploration of those juxtaposed view, to have synchronized interaction between the two views. So basically, when one object is selected, it appears selected on the other view as well. And the most important part of synchronizing the interaction is to have a clear visual feedback on both views at the same time. And so we'll here represent a few analytical use cases involving these juxtaposed view and the space-time cube method. So the first one will be about identifying cell divisions and waves of cell divisions in our data sets. So basically, in embryology development, there will be some moments where a lot of cells will divide at the same time. So here the user can use the information of the time before the next division and filter the superfluous information to be able to just highlight only the places with waves of divisions that can appear clearly on the 3D view. And from here, since we know at which time the cells will divide, a lot of cells will divide, we can approach the 3D structure to have a detail on demand approach to find the information, the identifier or other information on the dividing cells. Our second use case will focus on asynchronous behavior and cell deformation. So the asynchronous behavior we talk about here would be around cells that do not divide during the waves of divisions that we just identified. So to do so, the user can just explore inside the 3D view. And since they identified the waves of divisions, they can see which cells did not divide during these particular periods. And yeah, so here they can get the identifier, the information that they want. And if needed, they can also take another cutaway view to see the exact deformation and the particular behaviors that these cells could have. And as we can see here, there is a strong deformation that can also be visible on the 3D model as well. Okay, so we try to assess the benefits of this generated space-time cube for the observation of 4D objects. So we made a user study involving 12 participants and asked them to perform 3 tasks. First, the identification of waves of divisions, the identification of asynchronous behaviors, and to be able to find cell divisions. So we are then to perform the 3 tasks into 2 conditions, one with only the mesh visualization and one with also the mesh and the space-time cube. Those numerical results signified that there was significantly better results using the mesh and space-time cube in the tasks of waves of divisions and finding asynchronous behaviors in the data, and yet for finding divisions, there were mitigated results. So maybe the space-time cube was not as useful, or maybe even could disturb the users. So we conclude that 4D objects with large temporal components could be easier to identify using this view. So basically, larger behaviors and global behaviors appearing in the datasets. We demonstrated these methods with experts that also guided us a bit during the conception of this method. And we asked them to just to explore the data sets using those 2 views and to give us some feedback. As perspective, they made several of them made a comparison between the space-time cube and the cell lineage classic visualization. So this is a view that represents cell divisions in this kind of data, but it also gave a good view of the spatial deformation of the spatial information as well. So this could be interesting for them. So to conclude, we propose here a method to get a static view of a cut over time. We propose to juxtapose classic 3D views of a model with with our generated visualization in order to be able to interact and explore more easily the 2 views. And we found that this method could help analyzing movements and behaviors with large component 4D objects with large temporal components. So now that we designed a method to see global behavior, to have a global behavior overview, we try to aim at the visualization of more local temporal contexts, maybe 4D objects of medium size. And as such, we relied on timelines. So we propose a timeline design space made for immersive exploration of 3D temporal data. To do so, we relied on an existing timeline design space made by Bremer in 2017. So this design space is composed of 3 dimensions. First, the representation, which gives the general shape of the timeline, the guiding curve of the temporal axis. The second dimension is the scale, giving the temporal origin and distance in the timeline. And finally, the layout, which gives the nature of the partitioning of the timeline. Maybe there are several timelines, one next to another, juxtaposed, or maybe the timeline is segmented into several pieces. So this information is given in the layout dimension. So our objective was to extend this 2D timeline design space to adapt to virtual environments. The point was to be able to visualize 3D temporal data over a timeline, to be able to use the third dimension of the virtual environment to create expressive visualizations, and to support the exploration of such visualization, relying on 3D interaction and natural navigation in VR. And as such, we propose a 4D design space for our 3D timelines. So first, the layout and scale dimensions will be very similar to classic timelines. But we extended the representation dimension in order to be able to define curves defining the 3D space, to have control over the radial space of the user, but also the vertical space above and below. And finally, we propose an additional dimension, the supports, which makes basically this transition between a visualization in a 2D display to a 3D virtual environment. So we will detail a bit these two last dimensions. So first, let's talk about the representation. We propose a few curves, a few representations that could take advantage of the radial space of the user. So even for a straight, A figures, even with a straight linear line, the user can take advantage of the natural navigation of the gaze to see around them. But in example B, with a curve, we could also regulate the distance between the user and the data, maybe have time points all around the user at the same distance or at interactive distance. And finally, the two last examples might help to put an emphasis on the local temporal context, since, the parabola could show the whole information, but still have a really close range next to the users. Another type of representation that we propose uses the vertical space with, for example, a helicoid or spherical representations. And the idea is to be able to have, again, more time points displayable at close distance for both visualization and interaction for more control. And it could also be useful to create expressive visualization that can, for example, show periodic data. For example, with the helicoid, one cycle could represent one period of time. Next, let's talk about the support dimension. So the idea of this dimension is to have a 3D shape that will support the timeline branches in the 3D environment. So we talked about the layouts that could involve partition over of the timeline. So here the support dimension defines in which 3D shape they will be displayed. So first we have an horizontal plane support that could allow the users not to have to do vertical movements, which might be quite uncomfortable. We can also use different supports to have more flexibility in the application design, using multiple planes to have maybe above, below, or all around the users, different planes to visualize the different segments, different branches. Or maybe one of the two other examples can help in getting classifications over different parameters to classify the different branches of the timeline. Once again, to get more expressive visualizations. Then we propose to, support the exploration of such defined timelines with 3D interaction. So we consider here the most important visualization tasks that should be achievable with 3D timelines. The first one will be about being able to explore the information in each time point and to get access to information directly with details on demand approach. So as you can see here, the users can manipulate. There is a synchronized view between the time points. The user can just manipulate them. Second type of tasks that should be available will be around changing the content of the time points, being able to change the color mapping or to highlight maybe some specific places, and to be able maybe to filter by information to, on the other hand, on contrary, remove information. The last point will be about being able to modify the timeline design. The user should be able to arrange the visualization in order to better fit their analytical use case. The second major part of 3D interaction will be around navigation. So the user should be able to move in space. Maybe one part of the methods could involve movement of the users in the space, maybe by natural navigation or other navigation method with teleportation, maybe, or simply, as in this video, just through gaze exploration of the timeline around the user. But another way to explore the timeline, the 3D timelines, can involve moving the timeline instead of the user. It can be done like here through a selection of a time point to move directly the timeline to get the time point selected. or maybe with smooth movements that can maybe have a better precision to select the right time point. Then we try to evaluate, to assess the benefits of 3D timeline for the exploration of 3D temporal data. So once again, we did a user study, this time involving 21 participants. This experiment involved an abstract data set that were shown actually in the previous videos, with a few objects at each time point in order to have a simpler 3D exploration. And we got in this data set also numerical and categorical information in order to be able to evaluate on classic analytical tasks. And these tasks were made with different designs in order to be able to compare different 3D timeline designs, but also to be able to compare with traditional temporal exploration methods. So basically we had 4 analytical tasks. The first one was a locate task. The user were given a number of a time point and they had to get there. The second task was about counting. They were given a color and they had to count every object with this color. Third one was about finding a pattern. So an object being like red, then blue, then orange, and the users had to find all of the objects presenting this pattern. And finally, as shown in the last image, they had to find a global maximum over the temporal information, over the whole data sets. This was done in 3, each of these tasks were made in 3 conditions. So first, in the first image, without timeline, so relying on slider to explore time. A second condition was using a curved timeline, and third condition with a helicoid timeline. Numerical results show that for locate and counting tasks, so basically tasks which required mostly exploration at one time point, and that did not really require temporal context, we got mitigated results. So basically classic methods could just work the same way. On the other hand, for the 2 other tasks, the pattern and maximum, which did require some temporal context to do the analysis of temporal context, we got better, significantly better results with the timeline designs. We also asked the participants to answer which condition they found more comfortable or more efficient to answer each of those tasks. And what is interesting here, the graph is a bit complex, but what's interesting here is to see that no one preferred using the no timeline condition, using sliders in the pattern task. And that there was a really strong preference for the curve condition in every task. So we think that it was because doing vertical movements might have been uncomfortable for the users because of the material, maybe because of the VR headsets. In the following, we push a concrete use case to test the 3D timeline visualization. So again, we consider this embryo development data sets, but this time we focus on another analytical task regarding the differentiation of cells, the exploration of differentiation of cells. So once again, we will use the information of the time of divisions, as seen here, but also the information of the fate map, what we call a fate map, which basically give the information, like this fate map, which give the information of differentiation of which kind of tissue each cell will turn into. So here, as you can see, the user can select 2 cells that are not yet annotated, and by exploring in time, by exploring the cell divisions, they can see at what time the differentiation happens, actually. We did a demonstration on this use case with 20 experts. We showed the users how to define a local spatiotemporal context in the 3D timeline, obtaining this kind of 3D structure. So as you can see, maybe the time point numbers are from 5 to 71, and we only get a timeline with a few time points highlighting particularly the cell divisions in order to show the cell differentiations over time. So we got some feedback from these experts, and they gave us some perspective of views of the 3D timelines. First, in terms of comparisons of different data sets to be able to compare imagery with ground truth, or maybe two different data sets, two different image data sets. But they also consider the option of exploring different subjects of organoids, maybe which could be involved in cancer research. So to conclude, we propose here a 3D timeline design space with 3D interaction processes for classic visualization tasks, and especially to be able to define local temporal contexts, local temporal regions of interest to observe. And finally, we evaluated the 3D timelines for the visualization of 3D temporal data. So finally, we wanted to approach 4D objects that would have a really short lifespan, and propose a selection method to be able to select them. So we propose a particular selection process to be able to select those punctual events in 3D temporal data sets. So the context, let's remind the calcium signal data sets. Here, the issue is not in space, because the objects are quite sparse and sometimes quite large as well, but they are very short in time. Here, for example, these data sets had 100 time points, and we could find this is one of the longest signals that could appear only over 4 time points. So we tried to propose a process that could help to select these particular types of objects that could be really short in time. Traditional methods would rely on the selection of one particular time point and the exploration of a 3D space, do a 3D exploration at each of those time points. What we propose is to have a space then time process, which basically is based on only one 3D exploration, followed by one disambiguation in time. So instead of getting 1D for time times 3D exploration, 3D exploration, we get only one exploration plus one disambiguation in time, so one dimension to explore. The emerging issues here, first, how to visualize enough information to get in one 3D view. Then how to select the information to get the right object. And finally, how to disambiguate in time between the maybe several objects that could have been, that could correspond to the selection. So we proposed this process and could not actually complete the study. So we have a few prototypes and could not evaluate it. But we thought about several techniques to answer each of the axes that I will present now. So about the first axis, about visualizing 3D temporal information into one view, we proposed a method of aggregation. So as for example, here we did a density map visualization. It's basically a flattening in time. So we have the 3D information, all of the objects that appear leave a trace in the density map. We could have explored other techniques based on maybe animation. So to be able to see quickly, have a video playback of the data sets, or maybe rely on juxtaposition to have maybe several views to display the temporal information. About the second axis, about selecting information in the 3D view, to continue with the density map, we propose a volume selection based on the brushing interaction. So the user just selects through the 3D volume. But other technique could rely on the placement of landmarks or the drawing of a trajectory that could fit with the movements of the objects to select. Finally, about the disambiguation in time, we could rely on a list of objects, of the closest object appearing with the selection, basically with the name of or some particular information available regarding each of the objects. We could use 3D timelines to be able to visualize each of the objects found into several juxtaposed timelines, or to rely on automatic methods with cost functions to select the closest object that could fit the selection of the user. So to conclude, we proposed a space and time selection process that focused on the selection of temporally short 4D objects. We propose here quite general methods that could be adapted to depending on the use case, depending on the use case and the 3D temporal data sets. And to conclude, I'd like to first summarize our contributions. So first, we proposed the space-time hypercube as a representation of the 3D temporal data that could allow an efficient visualization of temporally large 4D objects, global movement, global behaviors. Then we proposed a design space for 3D timelines that could create expressive visualization for 3D temporal data, and proposed to use 3D to we proposed 3D interaction to support the exploration of this temporal data in order to be able to select local spatial and temporal regions of interest. And finally, we explored a different selection process, a space then time selection process to support the selection of temporally short 4D objects. In terms of perspectives, for the space-time hypercube, we thought about enhancing the projection operator. So here the user could only place a plane that would stay the same over time. Maybe we can find a way to make the plane move or to follow maybe one particular 4D object. And also we should evaluate this method with different types of data, with different density or different types of movements of the 4D objects. About the 3D timelines, we consider that the design space might be possible to enrich, proposing different types of 3D curves that could be more expressive depending on some use cases. And also, we would like to further evaluate the different components of the design in order to help future users to be able to choose more easily between the different components of the 4D design space. And finally, about the space then time selection, where we would like to further study and prototype and evaluate these methods. So about long-term perspective, we think that the most important the most important issue to explore now will be about the comparison of 3D temporal datasets. So Kim et al. Proposed a review of comparison methods for 3D and 3D temporal datasets, and found that there was a lack of methods for 3D temporal comparison, especially for volumetric or mesh-based datasets. So our contributions on this question, where we could use adapted 3D timeline layouts as it was suggested by experts to support comparison, but in future works we could consider trying to define user-friendly 4D sets operation, or to have to explore possibilities of juxtaposition in large 3D environments to support comparisons as well. And thank you for your attention.